poverty is about the lack of sufficiency. And I think it's very important to define what we mean in that regard, because there are different sorts of poverty. There is material poverty, the most obvious. Then there's spiritual poverty. And of course, the two things don't go hand in hand. Africa is spiritually rich. In one sense, it is materially rich, but its peoples do not obtain the benefits of that wealth. They are impoverished by a combination of greed, corruption on the part of the world's vampire elites, that group of people, whether on the continent or elsewhere. But there's also the poverty that arises from the imbalance of power in our world. You see that in terms of the way in which, all too often, the terms of trade between Africa and the rest of the world operate against the interest of Africa and its producers. So differing sorts of poverty, differing contexts by which that poverty is created and entrenched. But it's also important, I think, to approach these issues of combating poverty with the right approach. The people of Africa need to be very careful in terms of rejecting an approach to nation building that sees them always as the recipients of aid and beneficence, charity from the rest of the world. What Africa needs and demands is fairness, an end to the entrenched, institutionalized imbalances that deprive Africa. So we don't help ourselves by jumping on to this poverty relief bandwagon. We should look for solutions to the challenges that we face that are rooted in growth and in enterprise. So I think all of us have a responsibility, whether in Africa or outside Africa, to make sure that we learn the lessons of our past, the mistakes that have been made, both within Africa and outside, because the people of Africa have not benefited. They have been preyed upon by people outside Africa who deprive them of fair terms of trade. They have also been preyed upon at times by their own political leadership. Now, the good news is I see that that's changing. A new generation is coming forward, which is more accountable. More countries now are subject to the disciplines of democracy. Also, and importantly, the countries of the developed world, the developed economies, are themselves at last taking the issue of corruption seriously, because corruption is a two-way street. There is the corruptor and the corrupted. They work together against the interests of the people of Africa. I think the important thing is that the hypocrisy of an approach that condemns corruption while doing nothing about the corrupter, that condemns the transfer of resources away from their intended purposes, whilst providing a safe haven for those resources. One thinks of the previous experience of Mobutu and others. I think that hypocrisy is now revealed for what it is, as hypocrisy. And I think as a result of that, you've seen a tightening up of policy. Banking practices are being tightened up in order to deal with that. And as I say, you've got the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and other initiatives that are designed to promote accountability and transparency by the developed economies, by those previous havens of dirty money, dirty diamonds, blood diamonds, and all the other excesses that have characterized, I fear, a good part of the 20th and 21st century. Let's talk about promoting enterprise. Let's talk about promoting fair trade. Let's talk about removing some of the obstacles to fair trade. Let's put it in that way, rather than a constant focus on the rhetoric of opposing poverty, whilst doing nothing, actually, to create the conditions in which people themselves are liberated and their own wealth developed. Africa is a rich continent. The people of Africa are rich in talents and in skills. Indeed, if you look at the wider world, if you look at the professions, if you look at the civil service, and you look at business globally, sometimes you find more Africans in foreign countries than you do in Africa itself, utilizing their skills, talents, and capacity. Now, that's an indictment. It's an indictment of the conditions that have been allowed to exist in Africa, and it is an indictment, frankly, of a world that continues to label Africa as poor and poverty-stricken, even whilst that same world exploits the resources of Africa and Africans. We continue to tolerate a situation in which African intellectual property is stolen on a regular basis from Africa. We continue to collude in practices that support the vampire elites within Africa itself. And we continue, I am afraid, not to be prepared as donor countries and as wealthy and developed countries to practice ourselves what we preach. So, there's a lot we can do, and I'm bound to say, too, that there's some real signs that we are doing more and getting it more right than wrong. But it's taken a long time to get to this point, and it's not enough. Let me give you an example. If you take a country like Ghana, which I know well, for many years, the World Bank and the international financial institutions positively starved Ghana of the resources to maintain and develop its infrastructure. So much so that in Ghana, like in the rest of Africa, there are fewer serviceable roads and rail networks now than there were at independence. I can remember independence. I waved a flag 50 years ago at Ghana's independence. At that time, my grandfather, the cocoa farmer, could transport his cocoa direct from Old Tafo, where our farms were, to the port of Takoradi by rail. That can't happen today. And one of the reasons why it can't happen isn't just because of a failure of policy making and policy delivery within Ghana itself. It is also because the World Bank and others who ought to know better were not investing in infrastructure. It's also the case, I fear, that Kwame Nkrumah's call for stronger regional and Pan-African structures were for many years ignored. I'm happy to say that's now changing. My sense is that we allowed ourselves to become entangled in a network of financial instruments and practices, the full extent of which and the implications of which we simply didn't understand. And we allowed an obsession almost with deregulation, with the market to take over. Now, I happen to believe in a market economy. I think free markets are the best source, both of growth and actually of maintaining and ensuring that we embed in our societies political freedom. So I'm a believer in free markets. But I think those free markets have to be subject to effective regulation. And I think we failed in terms of the regulatory regime. These are failures. They're failures of governance, domestic African governance and international governance of financial institutions. and departments of development. And at the end of the day, failures of governance have to be addressed by the citizen in Africa and the citizen globally, saying to their political leadership, enough is enough, and we want a change. And we want that change to be founded on justice and equality and freedom and respect for the individual's dignity and national sovereignty. You know, power concedes nothing without a demand. But, you know, one of the things that we've got to do is to learn from this whole experience. And one of the things we have to learn is that the West and the developed economies of the North don't have all the answers. South Africa is a classic example of a nation that asserted its own sovereignty, its own right to determine what best suited its market. They have a very effective banking and financial services regulatory regime there. To my certain knowledge, they were told by the developed economies of the North to deregulate. They were told to embrace the same approach to regulation that we all embraced. Had they listened to us, their economy would have been destroyed in the course of the banking crisis. As it was, their banks were largely untouched. So we in the North have got to have a degree of humility. We mustn't replicate the same mistakes again and go around dictating to the rest of the world that we know the best and you must do what we do. We don't know the best. We didn't know the best. And the world looked into the abyss in 2008, 2009, and it wasn't a pretty picture. So it's absolutely vital that as we build a new world order in terms of financial services, banking and regulation, that we listen, and we listen to the people of the South. We listen to the people of the emerging and developing economies of the world and their representatives, and don't repeat the mistakes of the past, which I fear have been characterized by our own arrogance and our own belief that we always know best and that the market always knows best. We and the market don't always know best. We can all benefit from sharing good practice and from effective regulation and a willingness to listen and to learn. We know the basics of what we need to do. We've got to build on that knowledge. We've got also to recognize that our international financial institutions are not fit for purpose. They need to be reformed. They need to be made more accountable and more transparent. They need to better represent the developing and emerging world. The international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, are not in fact genuinely representative bodies. They are not as open as they should be to the day-to-day experiences of farmers seeking to make a living in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the developing world. We need to listen more to the experience of ordinary people and their representatives, and we need to open up and make more transparent these institutions. We also need to make sure that as we deal with the issues of climate change, that we don't replicate the self-same imbalances, that the absence of power on the part of one group of people in the world and the prevalence of power on the part of another have created. We need to respect the developing world and its interests. So we have got to be prepared to listen, to learn. We've got to be prepared to share good practice, to be vigilant in opposing corruption, whether north, south, east or west, and to reintroduce values into our politics and into our corporate and national governance. Values actually of communality, values of sharing, values about caring. Those things are important. They're not soft, weak words. To share, to care, they are the basis of humanity. They're the basis upon which we all accept, the theory and the practice of Ubuntu. You know that concept from Southern Africa, but to be found all over Africa. The word is from Southern Africa, but the concept is African. We are what we are because of others. We are all interrelated, one to the other. We will succeed or fail together. And any ideology, any way of life, which is founded on the notion that one group of people must be subordinate and their interests must be subordinate to another, that will fail. So we have to rediscover our common humanity and the values that underpin it. And we need to make that practical policy, not airy-fairy idealism, not some sentiment. Love not as a sentiment but as a strategy. We need to love each other, love our world, and love and respect our planet and its environment. If we do that, we've got a future. If we don't, we haven't.